In 1804, during a routine inspection of the Qing Dynasty's most elite military families, officials uncovered something that sent the emperor into a fury. 19 teenage girls from the bordered yellow banner, one of the 3 banners under the emperor's direct command, had broken their own feet. They had systematically fractured and folded their toes beneath their soles, wrapped them in cotton, and hidden the damage beneath wide Han-style robes. When Emperor Jiaqing was informed, he did not treat this as a medical concern or a youthful indiscretion. He treated it as treason. Their fathers were stripped of rank. Their commanding officers faced impeachment. The entire bureaucratic chain of the banner was thrown into crisis. Over 19 pairs of shoes. The reason had nothing to do with fashion. It had everything to do with what the female body was for. The Qing Dynasty was governed by the Manchu, a northern minority ruling a vast Han Chinese majority, haunted by one fear above all others, that the customs of the conquered would swallow the identity of the conquerors. If Manchu women began to look like Han women, to dress like them, to cripple their feet like them, the ethnic boundary that justified Manchu rule would dissolve from within. And so the female body became the front line of that war, regulated, inspected, and reshaped through practices that left marks the state could read at a glance. Before a woman could be considered presentable for marriage or for the imperial draft, her face had to be stripped clean. The practice was called facial threading, 绞面, and it served as both beauty treatment and rite of passage. An experienced older woman would coat the girl's face in a thick layer of white powder to dry the oils and give the thread grip. Then came the instrument, a single length of tough red silk, twisted into a figure 8 and held taut, one end clamped between the practitioner's teeth, the other ends manipulated rapidly by her hands. As the twisted thread rolled across the skin, it caught dozens of microscopic hairs simultaneously and ripped them out by the roots. The process took 30 to 40 minutes of sustained, localized trauma. The areas around the eyes and upper lip were the worst, each pass leaving the skin hot, swollen, and stinging. Tradition demanded the young woman endure the ordeal without crying, because tears were considered an omen of a doomed marriage. So she sat rigid, absorbing the pain in silence, while her face flushed a deep, angry red. The aftermath lingered for days, micro-tears across the skin, weeping follicles, and a high risk of infection and scarring that could mark the face for years. The Chinese term for this ritual, 开脸, said everything. The natural, unmarked girl was being stripped away. What emerged was something cultivated, polished, and made ready for use. Beneath the embroidered robes, the body itself was expected to vanish. Confucian modesty in the Qing Dynasty demanded the total suppression of a woman's natural contours, and the garment responsible, a specialized undergarment called the dudo, was built for exactly that purpose. Diamond-shaped, with straps tied around the neck, and strings pulled tight around the waist and back. The dudo pressed the chest flat against the ribcage. Unlike the Western corset, which exaggerated curves, this garment erased them, producing a linear, prepubescent silhouette that the era's aesthetics celebrated as the apex of feminine refinement. See, the consequences were not a side effect. They were structural. The continuous compression restricted lung expansion and diaphragm movement, forcing women into chronic shallow breathing that produced lethargy, dizziness, and a sickly pallor, which was, in a vicious irony, celebrated as a marker of aristocratic beauty. The restricted chest wall also prevented effective clearing of the lungs, directly contributing to the spread of pulmonary tuberculosis among women of the era. The practice was so deeply embedded that it took a radical social movement to dismantle it. In 1915, a Chinese women's magazine published a comparison that captured the paradox. The old abuse only harmed human feet. The new abuse harms human chests and lungs. Harming the feet is a minor injury. Harming the chest and lungs is a far greater and deeper injury. By 1927, women in Wuhan marched through the streets declaring chest binding a poisonous snake wrapping around our bodies and souls. The following year, the government issued a nationwide ban, granting women, for the first time, the legal right to breathe freely. For centuries, the garment designed to suppress the female form had also been suppressing the female lung. The empire treated both as acceptable losses. Threading and chest binding crossed ethnic lines in varying forms. But the Qing Dynasty imposed one standard on Manchu women alone, and it transformed the earlobe from flesh into a political document. 6 puncture wounds in a newborn's ears. That was the requirement. 1 ear, 3 piercings, 一耳三钱, mandated 3 holes in each earlobe of every girl born into the Manchu banners, and it was non-negotiable. The instruments were crude, the concept of sterilization centuries away. In the bitter winters of the north, fresh puncture wounds were vulnerable to frostbite. In humid summers, bacterial contamination set in quickly. For impoverished banner families who could not afford gold or silver, the requirement was still absolute. They kept the holes open with heavy copper rings that oxidized against the skin and compounded the risk of infection. Look, this was never about aesthetics. It was identification. Han Chinese women traditionally wore 1 earring per ear. The 3 piercings marked a woman as Manchu, as belonging to the ruling class, and during the imperial draft, 选秀, inspectors checked. If a candidate arrived with fewer than 3 piercings per ear, her family faced censure, demotion, or worse. The female body carried the ethnic boundaries of the empire in its flesh. The jewelry itself was a visible taxonomy of power, codified by law and graded with the precision of a military rank system. An empress wore 3 gold earrings per ear, each set with first-class Eastern pearls. A noble consort received second class, a consort third, a concubine fourth. The quality of pearl dangling from a woman's earlobe announced her exact position in the imperial hierarchy before she spoke a single word. Emperor Qianlong took enforcement personally. In 1775, during a selection of bondservant candidates, he noticed several women wearing only a single pendant per ear, a Han fashion that had begun infiltrating the Manchu aristocracy. He issued a formal edict declaring that the 3-piercing custom must absolutely not be altered, and that any banner woman who abandoned it was unexpectedly no longer Manchu. In palace dramas like the story of Yanxi Palace, the 3 piercings are displayed as a striking aesthetic detail. Palace maids shown wearing a single pearl with 2 plain metal rings, while the empress wears full sets of Eastern pearls, an accurate reflection of the graded system. What the drama could not reproduce was the bleeding from crude metals pressed into newborn skin, or the slow gravitational pull of heavy gold stretching the earlobe tissue over decades until the piercings became elongated slits. Elderly Manchu women in the early 20th century still bore that damage. Visual markers of a dynasty that had already fallen. The piercings were only the beginning of what the body carried. On ceremonial days, the full weight of rank settled onto a consort's frame in layers, and the Forbidden City expected her to bear every gram of it in silence. A 108-bead court necklace of jade or coral dragged against the collarbone, a surviving artifact gifted to Zhenfei, the favored concubine of the Guangxu emperor, weighs a verified 342.3 grams. Above it, a crown of woven rattan encrusted with gold filigree and rubies balanced on the skull, anchored by hairpins driven into hair pulled so tightly, it caused chronic headaches and permanent hair loss from the constant tension. The ceremonial robes were layered in gold-threaded silk and dense marten fur, stiff enough to restrict arm movement and prevent wide strides. A slight nod could send the heavy crown shifting dangerously. A muscular spasm in the neck was the price of keeping it straight. By the time a consort stepped from her quarters, she was encased from skull to sole in an architecture of precious metal, dense stone, and constricting fabric, and the court demanded she move through it, as though none of it weighed a thing. But every gram was a reminder of who the body underneath belonged to. Zhenfei bore this weight for years. When Empress Dowager Cixi decided she had become a liability, eunuchs led her to a well in the palace courtyard. The 342.3-gram necklace, the crown, the 3 sets of pearls, adornments of a body the empire decorated, owned, and discarded at will. The weight pressed down from the outside. The poison worked from within. The Qing Dynasty aesthetic demanded a stark, unnatural contrast. Blindingly white skin against vivid, blood-red lips. The white came from lead powder, applied directly to the face every morning. The red came from cinnabar, mercury sulfide, painted onto the lips, absorbed through the mouth in trace amounts every time a woman ate, drank, or spoke. The full architecture of that poisoning cycle, how lead darkened the skin it was meant to brighten, how the pursuit of beauty accelerated the very decay it was designed to conceal, is a story we've already traced in detail. What matters here is who could afford the alternative. Even Empress Dowager Cixi, who ruled China for nearly half a century, could not fully escape the consequences. Historical medical archives reveal she suffered from severe hair loss, exacerbated by the ambient toxicity of court cosmetics, her rich diet, and the immense psychological burden of power. To conceal the thinning, she relied on elaborate false hair pieces attached to her scalp with adhesive red clay, an illusion of vitality constructed over a reality of decay. Her imperial physicians developed specialized formulas to combat the damage. Walnut and cedar leaf extracts soaked in snow water to stimulate the scalp, and dry shampoo blends of sandalwood, clove, and rose to absorb oils without risking the fragile remaining hair. She had the entire imperial pharmacy at her disposal. The average woman in Beijing had a market stall selling lead powder. Every practice described so far left marks on the surface. Stretched earlobes, poisoned skin, raw follicles, compressed lungs. The practice of foot binding, 缠足, went deeper. It restructured the skeleton itself. The process typically began between the ages of 4 and 6, before the bones of the foot had fully hardened. The objective was a foot no longer than 3 inches, roughly 7 centimeters. Achieving this required years of systematic destruction. It began in autumn, when cold air could partially numb the agony. The girl's feet were soaked in warm water to soften the tissue, the toenails trimmed short, and then the 4 smaller toes on each foot were bent, deliberately fractured, and pressed flat against the sole. A long cotton bandage was wound tightly around the foot, forcing the heel and the ball together, snapping the arch over weeks into a deep artificial crescent. The girl was made to walk on the result, using her own body weight to crush the bones further into submission. Infection was expected. Flesh frequently rotted. Toes sometimes fell off entirely from severed circulation, a development that was occasionally welcomed because it made the foot smaller. Archaeological evidence from the tomb of a 16-year-old Song Dynasty noblewoman, excavated in 1975, contained binding cloths over 2 meters long and tiny shoes measuring less than 15 centimeters, confirming that this level of destruction was being inflicted on children centuries before Chanzu reached its apex in the Ming Dynasty. Medical studies of women with bound feet found 5.1% lower hip bone density and 4.7% lower spinal bone density compared to women with unbound feet, translating directly into exponentially higher rates of catastrophic fractures in later life. Think about what that means. This was not merely a cosmetic practice. It was the systematic engineering of physical dependence. Women who could not run, could not labor, could not flee an abusive household without collapsing. The Qing rulers despised it. The Manchu conquerors, who valued physical vigor in both sexes, viewed Chanzu as Han cultural weakness and banned it outright for their own women. Emperor Kangxi formally prohibited the practice in 1668. The Han population ignored him on such a massive scale that he was forced to withdraw the ban, an emperor with the absolute authority to execute anyone who refused the Manchu Q hairstyle could not stop mothers from breaking their daughters' feet, and Chanzu kept infiltrating the banners, the very military households that formed the spine of the Qing state. The 19 girls who stood before Jiaqing in 1804 belonged to the bordered yellow banner, one of the 3 elite divisions directly controlled by the emperor himself. During the triennial selection, officials discovered they had arrived with bound feet and Han-style robes. Jiaqing did not treat this as a fashion lapse. He treated it as ethnic treason. The incident permanently transformed the draft from a marriage process into a militant inspection of ethnic purity. Jiaqing articulated the deeper anxiety himself. Men were easy to regulate. They appeared in public, wore their cues, could be monitored and disciplined. Women, he wrote, were deeply sequestered in the inner chambers, invisible and impossible to police. The female body, hidden behind compound walls, had been conducting its own quiet rebellion, and the emperor was losing. Decades later, during the Xianfeng era, the selection machinery ground forward even as the empire itself was tearing apart. The Taiping Rebellion had captured Nanjing. Provincial armies were being routed, and inside the Forbidden City, eunuchs were still lining up young banner women for inspection. A young woman named Changgu was among those drafted. The historical record preserves nothing about her rank within the banners, her age, or her appearance. What it preserves, with a careful attention typically reserved for moments that embarrass the throne, is her voice. When brought before the eunuchs for the initial screening, she did not lower her eyes. She declared, loudly enough for the assembled officials to hear, that entering the palace meant lifelong imprisonment, never seeing one's family again, a separation equivalent to death. She demanded to know why the emperor was spending resources hoarding women while the empire faced an existential threat from rebels who controlled half the south. If he did not seek capable generals to retake the fallen cities, she warned, there would be no dynasty left to need an heir. The eunuchs moved to silence her. She told them she did not fear death. Why would she fear a whipping? They bound her and dragged her before Xianfeng himself. When the emperor asked what she had said, she repeated every word. The historical account records that he was silenced by her audacity. He allowed her to leave the draft. She returned home, her reputation elevated, rather than destroyed by the incident. She married into a prominent literati family and was eventually included in a late Qing biography of virtuous women. A rare instance of open defiance against the imperial machinery being preserved not as scandal, but as moral courage. Changgu walked out. For the vast majority of women who stood before the selection, the beauty standards imposed on their bodies, from the threading table to the binding cloth, were designed to guarantee they never could. The thing is, every practice in this architecture converged on a single function, reducing the female body to a surface on which the empire could inscribe its anxieties, its hierarchies, and its control. The pain was not incidental to the system. It was the mechanism. A woman who could not walk could not escape. The shallow breaths forced by the binding left her too weak to resist, and the piercings in her ears ensured she could never disappear into a crowd. The last generation of women with bound feet hobbled into the 20th century on bones that would never heal. The political value of 3 piercings vanished alongside the dynasty that had enforced them, but the body was only the first thing the Qing court claimed. Beyond the physical apparatus, the piercings, the bindings, the lead and mercury lay a different kind of machinery, one that governed what happened to a woman's daily existence once she was inside the walls. Who she could speak to, what she could eat, when she was permitted to sleep, and whether she would ever again see the sky without a wall framing it. That machinery ran on different fuel entirely, and it was no less precise.